There is so much to talk about with Darwin. I don't want to obviously overwhelm, but partly it's because this is a scientist, obviously, with technical material that's involved. But it's also the case that Darwin is so consequential for the history of thought, for the life that we live right now, for the fate of religion. So I want to indicate some of the salient points that I wasn't able to get to in that brief introduction that you all have access to. The question I started that intro with was, what is success? I think that's something we want to keep in mind, but also what is progress? This unkillable notion that somehow things just get better and better. And partly this is tied to the fact of technological and material advancement. But why is it that even though the 19th century's optimism, its progressive confidence met a catastrophic end in the trenches of World War I, the notion of progress continues to dominate our imagination, I think. Or maybe we're coming out of that. That's one thing for us to discuss. But there's something peculiarly tenacious about this feel for the way things are. Now, that feeling is not exactly what evolution, as Darwin put it before us, gives us, because in fact, the strange thing about the evolutionary mechanism that Darwin proposed and on the origin of species isn't really purposive. Natural selection didn't win many adherents at the time. And in fact, it was not until the 1930s really that the neo-Darwinian synthesis vindicated natural selection. So it's one of the paradoxes that what Darwin did was convince people of the truth of evolution, an idea that had been around for decades in a kind of a serious way. But his real breakthrough, what made his evolutionary proposal different from the speculative thinkers that came before, was the proposal of natural selection as the mechanism. And that didn't go well because it seemed to put chance in the driver's seat. The whole era in which Darwin operated was an era of unbounded confidence. And now that era was the Victorian age, which if you were to track that based on the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, that's basically the last 2/3 of the 19th century. This was the time of the overwhelming success of the British Empire, which is by land area the greatest empire the world has ever seen. At its height, it had control over a quarter of the world's land. If one were to look at other factors that prepared for this age of supreme technological and industrial power that had never been seen before, you have the Reform Act of 1832, which had expanded the franchise and had made more democratic the electoral system in England. This Victorian era overlaps with the Belle Epoque as we know it now, from the 80s till the First World War. This was the zenith of European power in the world. It's since that First World War, that power has been on the wane. This was also a time of the great realization of the promise of publicity that we had seen with the Enlightenment. The literacy became almost universal in England, and that fed a massive reading public. Religion, we've already talked about, had many options before it: deism, atheism, pantheism, and evangelicalism, and Kantian moralism. So Darwin was coming into a very volatile time in terms of where a religious believer, a Christian, might feel him or herself as far as what sense to make of Scripture, the Bible, in relation to this massive expansion of technological power. What natural selection, of course, what evolution as opposed to natural selection does, and Darwin is the one who wins the day for evolution, is that it casts into grave doubt a literalist, a fundamentalist reading of the Bible, which was kind of prevalent from those who were still adherents of the religion, those who were more evangelical. The Methodists, for instance, were rising this time. So that was a problem. If we don't understand what we read several semesters now, the beginning of the cycle, the book of Genesis, if we don't understand that in a way that's literal, what does it have to say about our lives? So the basic stance of Darwin towards progress was still that of a normal Englishman of the time. So that's what's confusing, because there are the modern neo-Darwinians, they've eschewed the notion of progress, which is probably wise and it's humble in some respects. But Darwin himself, he belonged to the powerful class of English, the elite, and he had those expectations. But rereading this selection, I'm convinced how much Darwin, in fact, did hold to the progressivist view of history, and that raises all kinds of questions. What does it mean to make progress in social conditions? What does it mean to progress in one's own life? We've already seen Hegel talk about the progress of social and cultural development. That was in the air. We had Laplace giving us a theory at the end of the 1700s of cosmological development in his nebular hypothesis. So everything was starting to shift. 19th century gives us the flowing of everything in a great stream of evolutionary progress. In fact, reading The Origin of Species, Darwin's cousin Francis Galton developed his science, quote unquote, of eugenics, which would have such an effect on history in the early decades of the past century. And I think that's part of the reason that modern neo-Darwinians know to not wave the banner of progress when it comes to evolution quite as vigorously. So there is this question of if you get rid of providence in the development of natural history, is there going to be a power vacuum in which the elite, in this case, the English elite, is going to fill the gap and provide an ersatz kind of providence? And that's one of the questions I think we have to ask ourselves. If we don't believe that there's a kind of a plan, are we not reduced to making a plan? And in that case, are we not then going to be subject to those who have the power to enforce their plans, like the eugenicists? And that's one of the great struggles in the history of liberalism, of course, is that you've got liberalism meaning first the laissez-faire notion that industrialism means that you should, that the industrial capitalist said just let things go, even if there's this massive suffering in the new working class. Just it'll all work out. There's a struggle for existence, as evolution says. There's a survival of the fittest, as in fact Darwin took on as his own, as another way of describing natural selection. So that's a kind of way of being liberal, right? That everybody should just be able to make their way in the world as they can. But then with eugenics, you have that laissez-faire neoliberal dog-eat-dog viewpoint going against the other, and the really beautiful thing about liberalism, which is that each individual has rights against the majority and should be allowed to unfold his or her powers. And of course, eugenics trumps that. And so you've got this extreme identity crisis in liberalism that you see in the progressive era of the decades of the 19th century. So that's one of the things for us to think about. I don't want to keep on going though, because I think there's so much to talk about in this reading. Emma, if you wouldn't mind reading off the questions.
What would a successful life and a successful society look like to Darwin? How does liberal individualism fit into Darwin's evolutionary conjecture concerning the development of society and morality? How do neurology and aesthetic sensibility relate in sexual selection? How does Darwin's account of the origins of humanity catalyze historical consciousness in a way that devastates Christianity's credibility? How does Darwin's figuring of natural selection as the survival of the fittest situate his work in terms of the legacy of social Darwinism, including eugenics? How does Darwin's conjecture place the Victorian or European elite at the apex of human development?